The plant we now call marijuana spent most of its human history as string. Not medicine, not smoke, string. Rope, nets, sacks, the sail on somebody's boat. That is the first thing to understand about cannabis. Humans didn't discover it once. We discovered it 4 separate times, over roughly 10,000 years, and the smoke came last. The earliest hard chemical proof that anyone deliberately burned it to get high comes from a stone tomb on a mountain plateau in western China, dated to about 500 BC, and even that isn't the beginning. Before we get into it, if you find this kind of story worth telling, drop a like on this video and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it takes you about 2 seconds. Okay, back to the weed. Cannabis is one of the oldest cultivated plants on Earth, and for most of that history, it wasn't a drug. It was a weed, literally. It grew in the disturbed dirt around Stone Age camps, in trash heaps, along the edges of trails, wherever humans broke the ground and walked away. Genetic work published in Science Advances in 2021 traces the domesticated plant back to East Asia around 12,000 years ago, right at the dawn of agriculture. Not for the buzz, for the fiber. Cannabis grows tall and straight, and its stem is packed with long, strong bast fibers, perfect for rope, nets, sacks, sails. Here's the twist. When you breed cannabis for fiber, you accidentally breed the psychoactive punch out of it. Tall, hemp-style plants make lousy drugs. So for thousands of years, humans were literally selecting against the very thing this plant is famous for today. Which raises an awkward question. If nobody was chasing the high, how did anyone ever find it? The second discovery was easier. If you're growing acres of this stuff for rope, sooner or later you notice the seeds. Cannabis seed is about 1/3 fat, 1/4 protein, and it doesn't taste bad if you're hungry, which, in the Neolithic, you always were. Archaeologists find charred cannabis seeds in cooking pits from the Yellow River Valley to the Danube. It was famine food, everyday food, oil for a lamp, feed for a chicken. Nobody was writing poetry about it. The third discovery is where it gets slippery. You'll read on 100 websites that a Chinese emperor named Shen Nong prescribed cannabis for over 100 ailments in 2737 BC. That story is everywhere. It's also almost certainly not what it looks like. Shen Nong is a mythological figure, an ox-headed farmer god. And the earliest text that actually pins cannabis to his name, the Shenong Benkaojing, was written down roughly 2,500 years after he supposedly lived. It's a legend layered on a legend, which does not mean ancient people weren't using cannabis medicinally. It just means the receipts are younger than the story. To find the real receipts, you have to dig. So, dig. Northwest China, the Turpan Basin, some of the driest ground on Earth. In the early 2000s, archaeologists open a grave at a place called Yanghai. Inside is a man, maybe 35, laid out with a harp, a bridle, and, near his head, a leather basket and a wooden bowl. The bowl and basket are full of something green. At first they think it's coriander. It isn't. It's 789 grams of cannabis, radiocarbon dated to around 2,700 years ago, uncannily well preserved by the desert air. This isn't a pinch. This is nearly 2 pounds. And when Ethan Russo and Honggen Jiang's team published the botanical and chemical analysis in the Journal of Experimental Botany in 2008, they find something that changes the story. The big woody stalks have been stripped out. What's left is mostly the resinous parts: flowers, leaves, shoots. Somebody sorted this. Somebody knew which part of the plant did the thing. The chemistry backs it up. The sample still holds cannabinol, or CBN, which is what THC decays into over the centuries. In other words, when they buried him, that bowl was potent. And here is what nobody can quite explain about Yanghai. There is no pipe. No pipe means the story isn't finished. For the next chapter, you have to climb. About 200 years later, and far to the west, high on the eastern Pamir Plateau, at around 10,000 feet of elevation, there is a cemetery called Jirzankal. Thin air, cold sun, a hard place to bury anyone. And yet, people carried their dead up here on purpose. In 2019, a team led by Meng Ren published in Science Advances what may be the single most important cannabis paper ever written. They analyzed 10 wooden braziers, small wooden bowls, pulled from 8 of the tombs. Inside each brazier, a pile of stones. The stones had been heated until they cracked. The interior of nearly every brazier still carried the chemical fingerprint of CBN. Translation: 2,500 years ago, in a stone tomb on the roof of the world, somebody took cannabis flowers, dropped them onto rocks so hot they hissed, and let the smoke fill the chamber. It wasn't a pipe. The room was the pipe, and they weren't doing it to feel good on a Friday night. They were doing it around a corpse. This is the earliest hard, chemical, non-guesswork proof that human beings deliberately burned high-THC cannabis to inhale it, which means at long last, we've found the moment. Except we haven't. Because at almost exactly the same time, in almost exactly the same way, on the grasslands north of the Black Sea, the Greek historian Herodotus was writing down what he'd heard about a people called the Scythians. He describes them setting up small tents, heaping stones in a dish, throwing the resinous tops of cannabis onto the hot rocks, and, in his words, howling with pleasure at the vapor. For a long time, historians shrugged. Herodotus liked a tall tale. Then Soviet archaeologists opened a Scythian burial mound at Pazyryk and found, you can guess, a little tent frame, a bronze vessel, stones, and burnt cannabis seeds. He wasn't making it up. Now hold both of these in your head. Jirzhankal in the mountains of western China. Scythian barrows on the steppe. Two cultures, thousands of miles apart, both burning cannabis on hot stones, both doing it as a funeral rite, both doing it in roughly the same century of human history. That is not a coincidence you can wave away. That is a technique that had already spread, which means the actual discovery happened well before either group. We are, both times, looking at the copy, not the original. And that is the uncomfortable thing archaeology can never quite fix. Every headline you read, earliest evidence of cannabis smoking, is a lie by omission. What it actually means is earliest evidence that survived. Earliest evidence that happened to be sealed in a desert grave or a permafrost mound or a stone chamber at 10,000 feet. And that happened to be dug up, and that happened to be tested by the right machine. The real first time somebody accidentally leaned over a campfire built out of cannabis stalks, felt the world tilt, and thought, oh, that had to have happened many thousands of years earlier, around some hearth, in some cave. To some person whose name will never be spoken again, whose bones are dust, whose insight that this weedy plant near the trash pile could open a door inside your own head was the actual discovery. And we will never meet them. We only meet their descendants, 6,000 years downstream, burying each other with the good stuff. But here is the last twist, and it's a strange one. Look again at Jirzhankal. The chemistry team noted that the CBN levels in those braziers were unusually high, higher than you'd expect from the scrawny, low-THC cannabis growing wild across most of Eurasia at the time. The researchers carefully floated a possibility. The people burying their dead up on the Pamir may have been deliberately seeking out or even cultivating plants with a stronger kick. Which flips the story one more time. By 500 BC, these mourners weren't just stumbling on a psychoactive plant. They were shopping for it. They knew what the good stuff looked like. They knew which valley it grew in, which altitude, which time of year. Somewhere between the anonymous inventor at the campfire and the funeral on the Pamir, cannabis had stopped being a weed people tolerated. It had become a plant people chose. And that's really the arc of it. Cannabis wasn't discovered. It was noticed, and then noticed again, and then noticed a fourth time over roughly 10,000 years of human attention. First, the fiber in somebody's hand. Then the seed in somebody's bowl, then the poultice on somebody's wound, and finally the smoke in a small stone room, curling around the body of somebody you loved because you believed, you needed to believe, that they could still hear you through it. Which brings us back to the rope. That first twisted fiber, the one this whole story started with, is doing the same job it's done for 12,000 years, holding two things together that would otherwise drift apart. The mourners on the Pamir were doing the same thing, with different smoke. Every time a human being has touched this plant, from the Neolithic cord maker to the shaman at Yanghai, we have been trying to tie ourselves to something we're afraid to lose. Turns out we still are.